Good afternoon. It's Friday the 29th of November 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today, we have Mark Anderson and Debi Evans. And Debi, we're going to get started straight away with the assisted dying bill, which, of course, is being, inverted commas, debated in Parliament today. I did notice, Debi, that the room was mostly full, which, of course, it never is if they're debating war, for example.
No, good afternoon, everyone. And yes, thank you for that, Mike. And yes, I noticed too that the chamber was full. I wonder how full it's going to be later, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So yes, as you rightly said, Parliament are debating the private member's bill for assisted dying in the chamber today. It's going to be a 5-hour debate and the vote will take place around about 2:30. So we may actually be still on air during extra when the vote result comes through. I'm not quite sure, but I want to look at how slippery the slope actually is with regards to assisted dying. We've talked many times about the medically assisted in dying scheme in Canada, and now here we are looking at it in the UK. But I just want to refresh people with regards to two other countries, that Belgium and Netherlands. They've done an awful lot of work and they have had assisted dying for many, many years. They refer to it as euthanasia, and it's been extended now to cover the under 18s in exceptional circumstances. And they're now looking to make it new law for people with dementia, more flexible. This paper here, 217 from JAMA, research into potential organ donors after euthanasia, requiring hospital euthanasia for organ donations. I find this extremely concerning, and clearly that's what's been happening. As far back as August 2016, there have been 43 donated organs. And of course, this means that people would have to go into hospital for an assisted death because they have to be circulatory dead before organs are donated. And the results of the results in the paper show here that apparently in 2015, 2,023 patients had medical euthanasia in a population of 11 million. And it's thought that 10% of that potential population would be donors with at least one suitable organ for donation. So I'm just saying this is what is happening. This is evidence of what is going on in other countries. And I think we must need to be aware of all of it. And the rest of the world are watching us as well. You know, it's not just us in the UK who are extremely interested in this. The New York Times are reporting compassion or coercion, Britain's emotional debate over assisted dying. But according to YouGov, the poll here, it would appear that 3/4 of Brits support the assisted dying law. Now, it goes on to say that apparently 73% of Britons believe this should be legal and 13% not. But I think that I'll be able to prove to you that we could be looking at a false communication if you stay with us for extra. And I think that's going to be very important. But let's look at the bill itself. So UK Parliament, terminally ill adults, End of Life Bill 2024 to 2025. This was published on the 22nd of November 2024. And it's been presented by Kim Ledbetter, MP. She's put this through through a private member's bill. It's the second reading. But as well as today, assisted death, what else is going on in Parliament? And I just want to look at what is the up and coming business for today. So clearly the main debate is terminally ill adults, but you can also see funding for children's hospices, private members bill, interesting, goes alongside the assisted dying bill. There's also right at the end of the day, and buried is Sir Christopher Chope's vaccine damage bill. So I just wanted to highlight that bill. There are all of these bills that are taking place in the chamber today. But who is Kim Ledbetter? Well, Kim Ledbetter is the Labour MP for Spen Valley. And I noticed this next slide on the Greenbelt Festival because she, of course, is the sister of Jo Cox. And she started an organisation called More in Common, which is working for the common good. And indeed, the University of Huddersfield have actually now officially opened the More in Common Centre, which was actually a faith centre, formerly a faith centre, but that was closed down and it's now the Jo Cox More in Common. And you can see David Lammy's picture there and Tracy Brabin as well. If we go on to the next shot, we can see that Kim Ledbetter, she's the ambassador for the Jo Cox Foundation, More in Common. And if we go on to see her background, we can see actually she was a trainer. She was if you like to call her a physical coach, an activity coach. She was a hockey player. She says she's not party political. She's new to the voluntary sector and she's very people focused. Well, that's strange because I took those screenshots a couple of days ago and it's quite clear that she does have an agenda. Who's funding this organisation? Well, I looked at Astra. I didn't find out a lot about Astra. It's a loneliness charity and there's not much about it. But you can clearly see that the other funders are Joseph Rowntree and the Community Fund. But I do find, as we lay this bill down now in Parliament, it's very strange that none of those, the Joe Cox Foundation, has been mentioned in Kim Ledbetter's registered interest. So that is the context for today's parliamentary debate, but more to come in the news on assisted dying.
Yes, we'll be talking a little bit more about assisted dying later on in the news programme. But Debi, on Radio 4 a couple of days ago, and certainly in part of the debate this morning, there was the big question of whether this is the start of a, quote, slippery slope. And I'd be very interested to get your thoughts on, we're looking at what's happened in Canada, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in other countries that already have so-called euthanasia bills. Whether you're certainly suggesting at the early part of that segment that there has been a slippery slope in those countries.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure there is a slippery slope. And indeed in Canada, and we've spoken to Dr. Charles Hoff and we've spoken to other people in Canada who have said that this bill is extended for younger people, for people with dementia, learning disabled, and also the messaging is being pushed. And I'm going to show you later on in Extra why that I believe that this is a false communication, because we are being fed a death agenda here. We are literally having it forced down our necks. No one's listening to the vaccine injured, though, are they? Everybody's listening to the assisted dying debate, but nobody's listening to the vaccine injured.
No, we'll be talking about that in another segment in a second. But the other point here is that, Harry Metcalf, who's a farmer in the UK and has a YouTube channel, was talking about the recent budget for farming and the pressure that's on particularly older farmers as they're about to pass their farms on to the younger generation, and the potential of how are they going to feel the day before this new legislation comes into force, knowing that that their business is effectively potentially forever damaged by this legislation from the budget. This maybe gives some of these farmers an out.
Yeah, absolutely. It throws up so many questions for so many people. I mean, I spoke to my mum today and I said, Mum, the assisted dying bill, if you had a life insurance policy that perhaps expired next year, like the farmers losing their farms, if you had that, would you expect one of us to say to you, oh, Mum, it's probably time for your death, isn't it? Because we don't want to miss out on the insurance payment. Are people going to get coerced and gaslit into making a decision on an early death when they don't want to?
These are all very good questions. Well, Debi, thank you for that. We'll be talking more about this a little bit later in the programme, but let's come on to the issue of migration. And yesterday, our glorious leader, Keir Starmer, was speaking at number 10 Downing Street on this. He was giving a speech on migration. And this was, of course, following the announcement by the Office for National Statistics that net migration was at its highest ever rate last year. That was 906,000. So that's 906,000, nearly 1 million extra people in the country, never mind the people that left. So I've got a few clips from this because he made a few comments that I think need to be challenged. So let's just listen to the first. This was the introduction when he was admitting that the migration situation was by design.
Good afternoon. When we came into office, we immediately conducted an audit of the public finances, and we found a £22 billion black hole. Now, the Independent Office of National Statistics has conducted vital work on the state of immigration and found the previous government were running an open borders experiment. As the ONS sets out, nearly 1 million people came to Britain in the year ending June 2023. That is 4 times the migration levels compared with 2019. Time and again, the Conservative Party promised they would get the numbers down. Time and again, they failed. And now the chorus of excuses has begun. We heard that from the Leader of the Opposition yesterday. But what we didn't hear, what the British people are owed, is an explanation. Because a failure on this scale isn't just bad luck, it isn't a global trend or taking your eye off the ball. No, this is a different order of failure. This happened by design, not accident.
Now, if anybody thinks that there's a certain amount of hypocrisy in that, you may be justified in thinking that way. Was he telling the truth about it being a failure? I don't think it was a failure. It was intentional. As he said, it was by design. He went on to claim that the rules were going to be enforced.
So we're taking a different approach. We will publish a white paper imminently, which sets out a plan to reduce immigration. The Migration Advisory Committee is already conducting a review. And where we find clear evidence of sectors that are over-reliant on immigration, we will reform the points-based system and make sure that applications for the relevant visa routes, whether it's the skilled worker route or the shortage occupation list, will now come with new expectations on training people here in our country. We will also crack down on any abuse of the visa routes. For far too long, we've been casual about malpractice in our labour market, which sends a clear signal overseas that we're a soft touch. Well, no more. Our rules will be enforced.
Does anybody watching this believe that? He went on to talk about the situation of being a migration-based economy because we need these people working because there's so many people on long-term sick.
Because you cannot separate this failure from their refusal to do the hard yards on skills, on welfare reform, on giving our young people opportunities, rather than the easy answers of looking overseas. Because clearly the vast majority of people who entered this country did so to plug gaps in our workforce, skill shortages across the country, which have left our economy hopelessly reliant on immigration. 2.8 million people out of work on long-term sickness, a problem ignored, left to fester.
Now, that was, for me, Debbie, that was the most egregious comment that we've heard so far, because, of course, he's offering no acknowledgement about why 2.8 million people are on long-term sick. And, of course, anybody suggesting that perhaps it's the result of COVID policy, vaccination policy, anybody suggesting that, that's absolutely not possible, and therefore it is ignored. In the meantime, as you said a few minutes ago, the vaccine injured are being ignored. But indeed, the whole 2.8 million people are largely being ignored. In fact, so far, he's claiming that he's going to start putting pressure on these people to get back to work despite their illness.
Yeah. But he won't listen to them, will he? He's ignoring them. And, we have had warnings from the likes of the amazing Ed Dowd, who we've done an interview with. Please go and look on the website for the Ed Dowd interview. And Ed Dowd was looking at the rates of personal independence payments, the data from the UK government with regards to this huge rise in claims, many, of course, vaccine injured. They're ignoring it. They're not listening to the vaccine injured. They don't want to listen to the vaccine injured. And can you imagine some of these people with vaccine injuries, and we'll talk about Alison in a minute during the adverts, but these people cannot possibly go back to work. And yet Keir Starmer is quite clearly going to be refusing them benefits, making it conditional on them returning to work. They can't even get a doctor's appointment.
Right, exactly. It didn't end there. It got, I'm not going to say worse, but certainly as bad. Listen to this.
And I'm pleased to announce today a new security agreement between Iraq and the UK. This is a world first that will help us smash the people smuggling gangs and secure our borders. The Home Secretary has been out in Iraq to seal this deal, and we've also announced funding for Iraqi law enforcement to tackle this problem upstream, way before it reaches our shores.
Unbelievable hypocrisy. So let's just look at the scale of migration from Iraq, shall we? So this is non-EU migration according to the latest figures. And as you can see, India way out in front there with 240,000 people coming into the country last year. Nigeria, 120,000. Pakistan, 101,000. China, 78,000. Zimbabwe, 36,000. Iraq, 3,368. Iraq is 14th on the list. And yet he's proud of what he's doing with Iraq. So the Iraqi deal, you can see on screen what they're talking about here. I'm not going to go into detail on it right now. But of course, why would there be anybody coming from Iraq at all? This man is still not in prison for what happened in Iraq in 2003. And so the hypocrisy, bearing in mind that Tony Blair is the man with his hand up to Keir Starmer's back, this is sheer hypocrisy on the part of Keir Starmer. Then we've got comments from this. This is from 2023. Turkish, Egyptian and Iraqi Kurdish migrants could be sent straight back home to home countries. This was a Tory party policy. So, of course, he was elected on the basis of changing everything that the Tory party had done in the past. Absolutely not. He is simply continuing the same agenda. And what we're witnessing here is the Uni-Party in action. And so if anybody expects any substantive change in migration policy as a result of what Keir Starmer announced yesterday, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. So we'll talk more about this in Extra, I have no doubt. Mark, let me welcome you to the programme. And moving on towards, I suppose, more war-related topics, Jens Stoltenberg has been given perhaps part of his reward for what he did while he was head of NATO.
You could definitely say that. I'll comment very briefly. Stay tuned next week. I'll do a report on what Texas is doing to assist the federal government with their alleged plan for major deportations dealing with migration here. But anyway, a very unusual thing happened, Mike. Good day, everybody out there. Sorry I missed last week. Bilderberg actually issued any kind of information off-season, not in conjunction with their annual summer meeting. And what was that announcement? Very recently, Bilderberg Meetings mourns the loss of Professor Halberstadt, one Victor Halberstadt, a Dutch economist. And moving on, there's more to it, as you indicated, Mike, than just an obituary. This is from the obscure media department of Bilderberg. No physical address. No one is named who works there. It just comes out of nowhere, probably Holland. They said in their press release, it's with profound sadness that Bilderberg Meetings, as they're formally called, announces the passing of its esteemed co-chair and decades-long leader of the Bilderberg Foundation, Professor Victor Halberstadt. He did pass away back in September 13, but there were subsequent announcements. The Bilderberg press release went on to note Halberstadt cemented Bilderberg's profile as a key forum for constructive dialogue between European and North American leaders, always passing it off as just a dialogue. Anyway, the release, while saying Halberstadt carried out an impressive 44-year tenure in the leadership of Team Bilderberg, that release added the following, quote, Halberstadt's dedication to transatlantic relations, bipartisan cooperation, cross-sector exchange, and constructive critical discussions under Chatham House rule, of course, is considered by many to have been second to none. In fact, it turns out, Mike, that he was probably the longest serving individual in Bilderberg's history for that group. A little bit more about him. Halberstadt cemented Bilderberg's profile, as noted. Halberstadt's successor as chair of Bilderberg Foundation and co-chair of Bilderberg Steering Committee will be announced. Of course, it's been announced. Drum roll, please, in just a minute. Bilderberg co-chair Marie Kravis, she noted, we extend our deepest sympathies to his family and friends, etc. And we'll go from there. Halberstadt's been Halberstadt's been closely involved with the Bilderberg meetings since 1975, acting as its honorary secretary general from 1980 to 2000, and as chair of its foundation until his passing. His work spanned multiple sectors, including serving on advisory boards for major corporations such as Daimler Chrysler and Goldman Sachs, for various academic institutions, as well as being a member of the World Economic Forum's faculty since 1990. So he was a very busy man leading up to his passing, but he has been replaced. And as you indicated, Mike, Jens Stoltenberg did not make it all the way out of this internationalist fold. He is no longer the head of NATO, but he is taking over for Halberstadt as co-chair on the all-important steering committee. And that bottom segment of this slide is right from the bilderbergmeetings.org website. So right along with Marie Kravis, we now have Jens Stoltenberg sticking around. And he's been attending Bilderberg meetings ever since they met in Copenhagen, Denmark in 2014. And so he's going to be embedded there for the foreseeable future, while Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of Holland, of course, is now the new Secretary General of NATO. Anyway, this is the actual 71-word press release. It's the only mainstream press item I could find about Jens Stoltenberg and what's going on. It came from Bloomberg, and it just, I need not read it. It basically just gives the very basics that Jens Stoltenberg, the former Secretary General of NATO, will become the new co-chair of the Bilderberg Group, the steering committee. And a very important note along with that, however, is, as that slide indicates, Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite has long attended the Bilderberg meeting. So for Bloomberg to announce this is basically synonymous with Bilderberg announcing it. And this is just a little something I wrote up as a news brief. And people can read it. It basically outlines what I just got done saying, just as the Dutch PM, Mark Rutte, a long-term Bilderberg attendee himself, just as he settles in as NATO's 14th Secretary General, replacing Stoltenberg. Stoltenberg has decided to stick around with Bilderberg. The steering committee that Jens Stoltenberg will co-chair on Bilderberg right now has 31 members, and they're very important. They oversee the ultra-exclusive annual gathering. They decide who to invite, where to meet, when to meet, what to discuss, and how to pay for it all. And as I noted here, therefore, the revolving door between the public lives of these and many other officials remains well-oiled, guaranteed to further blur the important line between public service and privately conducted arrangements, which ensure the financial gain of those involved in Bilderberg, uphold their obscure deal-making, and uphold their shadow globalism behind the throne of officialdom, as I noted in this news release. And there's a little bit more background there about Stoltenberg, how long he was Norwegian prime minister before he got involved in NATO. People can freeze these slides and read them. And NATO, I noted, is a pillar of Bilderberg. NATO goes back to pretty much the beginning of Bilderberg when they met in the Netherlands at Hotel de Bilderberg in 1954. And hence the name of the meetings. That's where that name came from. And anyway, that basically sums it up, Mike. I don't know if we have any additional slides on this or not. I will note that when Stoltenberg became prime minister in 2000 in Norway, he was portrayed as the Norwegian Tony Blair, according to many news accounts, and his policies were inspired by Tony Blair's new labor agenda. So that tells you something about Stoltenberg's thinking when he was head of NATO, and now he's part of this steering committee for Bilderberg. And that pretty much sums it up. So this is sort of the musical chairs and movement of the chessmen, you might say, Mike, in the world of Bilderberg.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, calling him the Norwegian Tony Blair, that's maybe an insult to Tony Blair. And I say that with everybody understanding what my position on Tony Blair is. But anyway, let's move on. Thank you very much for that, Mark. If you like what the UK column does, we do need your support. If you could head over to support.ukcolumn.org, there are options to help us out. You could make a donation. You could join as a member, and there are various membership levels which you could pick something up from the shop, or you could pick something up from clivedecarl.com. We'll just mention that the membership gift vouchers for Christmas with Christmas trees on them are available on the shop at the moment. If you'd like to give somebody a UK Column membership as a Christmas gift, please do. We'll have material going out over the Christmas period, so that would help us out a lot. And just to also mention that, of course, the stuff on the shop is now available internationally again at last. People have been asking about this for quite some time. So if you haven't, if you're from outside the UK and you haven't had a copy of Your Life in Their Hands yet, please grab a copy. Maybe you could give that for a Christmas present as well. But if you can't do any of that, that's fine. Do share our material though, because we absolutely need everybody to be the algorithm, as it were, and try to get round the various censorship that we are experiencing. And so there are share links on the videos and the articles that are on the UK Column website. Please use them if you possibly can. And Debi, another reminder of a petition that's going on in Wales.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Yes, this is the wonderful Alison Butler in Wales. She started this petition to ensure diagnosis and treatment for people suffering from adverse COVID-19 vaccine side effects. Currently, there are 4,454 signatures. This petition has been censored, taken down. It's been a complete nightmare for Alison, but there's only until the 11th of December. We need another 5,000 plus signatures by the 11th of December. So please, everybody, please sign the petition, because it is for everyone.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Debi. Now let's move on to Ukraine. And well, the day before yesterday, on Wednesday, the NATO Ukraine Council was being held in Brussels. And this was, they said, to discuss the security situation in Ukraine following Russia's launch of an experimental intermediate-range ballistic missile last week. This, of course, is the Oreshnik. So they are extremely worried about this. They issued a statement. It said NATO allies reaffirmed their support for Ukraine. The attack, which targeted Dnipro, is seen as another attempt by Russia to terrorize the civilian population in Ukraine and intimidate those who support Ukraine as it defends itself against Russia's illegal and unprovoked aggression. As earlier noted by the NATO spokesperson, Farah Dakhala, deploying this capability will neither change the course of the conflict nor deter NATO allies from supporting Ukraine. That's their position. The reality is, of course, that this weapon is absolutely unstoppable by anything that NATO has in its possession. Here is Mark Rutte that Mark was talking about a second ago. His subsequent comment was, "Our support from Ukraine has kept them in the fight, but we need to go further to change the trajectory of the conflict." Now, whether Ukraine should have been kept in the fight or whether there should have been presence at a negotiating table by this point, perhaps that's something that Mark Rutte will appear in court for later on, as will Jens Stoltenberg and others. But he went on to say, "We need to provide critical air defences and deliver on the commitments made at the NATO summit in Washington." And I just want to remind everybody what this actually looked like and make the point that there are no critical air defences available to tackle this particular weapon, because this is a hypersonic weapon. It's an intermediate range hypersonic weapon, and there's no prospect of dealing with it with currently available technology on the NATO side. Now, we have been talking about Trump and whether Trump is going to be willing to or is actually going to do anything about Ukraine, or whether he's just posturing with an effort to get the EU to step up to the plate and do what, as he says it, pay for their own defence and to take the lead with respect to Ukraine. Well, we're starting to see the rhetoric coming from EU politicians. Here is the lovely Ursula, who was saying yesterday, consider this, Russia allocates up to 9% of its GDP for defence, while Europe averages only 1.9%. This disparity is problematic, she said, and she went on to talk about how they needed to change this situation. And all I can say about that is the thought of 9% of European GDP being in the hands of Ursula von der Leyen and her team in the European Commission for warfare is a scary one, and it's one that we should all be opposing, and certainly we should be opposing any effort by the UK to get involved in European defence at all. In the meantime, just before we leave Ukraine, I'll just mention, of course, Russia has been targeting power infrastructure, electricity supplies, at a time, of course, Ukraine coming into the winter again. And so people are getting around this in Ukraine by installing diesel generators in blocks of flats and so on. And, sometimes there's several hundred people living in a block of flats. So we're talking about fairly major installations of diesel generators and widespread across the country because the electrical supply has been disrupted so badly by Russia. I just be asking the question at this point, where is Greta? Because this is going to be pushing out lots of CO2 generating diesel fumes. And nobody seems to be terribly concerned about that at the moment, other than to complain about the fact that it's putting pressure on the Zelensky regime. So anyway, we'll keep you posted on this as it develops. In the meantime, the next topic that I wanted to talk about was Georgia. Because, of course, Georgia, as we know, experienced a war with Russia in 2008 in South Ossetia, because at that point, under Mikhail Saakashvili, the Georgian regime was very anti-Russian and very pro-EU. Well, people out in the streets there, because, in fact, the new Georgian government, which is much more Russian and pro-Putin, has decided to suspend its application for entry into the European Union. And so, as a result, we saw riots on the streets with water cannon and pepper spray being used. The so-called rioters themselves, or the rioters themselves, using lasers back at the police again. Now, these rioters, of course, claiming that, or they're disgust at the fact that the government has decided to postpone entry into the EU for now, because they've been putting pressure on this for a while. Now, this follows on from a law that came in last year from the Georgian government, which is very similar to the sort of foreign agents laws that we've seen in other countries around the world, in Russia and also in the United States for that matter. But Georgia doesn't want to see that the sort of NGOs, the Western-backed NGOs and think tanks and so on, pushing in their, and media, pushing in their narratives into Georgia that are certainly calling into question the result of the recent election and so on, amongst other things, and certainly calling into question this decision. But I just wanted to end by this segment by highlighting and reminding everybody about this organisation, BBC Media Action, because this is a so-called charity subsidiary of the BBC, which goes into countries and trains the media in those countries in the BBC way of doing things and in BBC-type narratives. So here we have them providing support to independent media in the Eastern Partnership countries. These are the countries to the east of the EU that the EU considers as part of its expansion arena. But specifically Georgia, they have an article here on their Media Action website, The Struggle to Remain Independent, Georgia's Net Gazette. And this article talks about how Media Action has gone in to help Net Gazette develop their capability in terms of pushing a particular narrative. And I just want to end by reminding everybody of the quote from this lady, Juliet Harkin, formerly of BBC Media Action, talking about Syria and saying that the BBC Media Action had worked in 2004. So remember, that's 7 years before the conflict in Syria, had worked with individuals within the Syrian ministry who wanted change and tried to get them to be the drivers of that. So they were not just going in to train media organizations or media and journalists and so on. They were actually specifically looking for people within the government of Syria at the time and trying to get them to be the drivers of change, which of course what we mean by that is regime change. And so it's absolutely appropriate, I think, for Georgia to be putting in legislation to try to stop this kind of activity. But when we see riots like this on the streets of Georgia, we got to ask, is this really a grassroots uprising, or is it in fact backed by this type of organisation and the Soros type organisations that we've seen operating in these countries over the years. Debi, let's come back to you and more on assisted dying.
Yes, thanks, Mike. And who is actually taking us down this slippery slope of assisted dying? Who wants us to have a right to a good death? Well, I want to introduce you to the campaigners for dignity in dying. So these, they're supporting Kim Ledbetter. And of course, we've spoken about Kim Ledbetter earlier. And this is where the key to the assisted dying door has come from her. And they want to spread the message far and wide about choice on billboards, newspapers, online. In fact, they want to spread the message from each corner of Britain right through to the centre of Westminster. This is a non-profit organisation based in Westminster. And at this point, I'd like to acknowledge and thank very much Dr. Callum Miller. His posts on X have been absolutely fascinating with regards to dignity in dying. So I'd like to thank him for his information. And also, I'd like to thank Charlotte Gill, whose whose first-hand experience, as you're going to see, was extremely interesting, because when you go down to the tube this week, what are you about to see? Let's have a look at Charlotte's video.
Assisted dying adverts at Westminster Tube. There are quite a lot of them. Fancy a bit of assisted dying? Global, right? Global, and global. Would you want the production company that gave you the news agents with John Soap or Emily Maitlis and Lewis Goodall to be running the tube advertising? Would you want the company that gave you LBC with James O'Brien, Paul Brand sometimes, and Carol Vorderman to run the tube adverts? They're very divisive. They put a lot of political content out. Well, they are running the tube adverts. They're running most of them. In September, they got one of the biggest outdoor advertising contracts with TfL. So people are saying, why doesn't TfL take them down? Because TfL gave that contract to Global. And the Mayor of London also has a contract with Global at something called the Outernet, which is that Tottenham Court Road. So, by all indications, they're perfectly happy with it, okay? And I'm just walking past all the adverts now, okay? You should watch my videos because I've explained it all. I've done some really in-depth work on this. It even touches on the fact that Carol Vorderman, an LBC employee Global, wrote about Esther Ranson in her book An Assisted Dying. There's just too many coincidences, and it all comes back to Global.
So thank you to Charlotte, because there's so much more to explore. But let's have a look at that poster one more time of a young girl dancing in the kitchen in her pink satin pyjamas, looking very happy to get her dying wish that her or her family doesn't suffer. Now, I want you to take note of this young lady, and the reason will become clear in a minute. But were you shocked at the adverts? Well, apparently TfL, Transport for London, according to the BBC, weren't shocked, and they say that their adverts are compliant, and they campaign for positive imagery. Now, this is where I take it back to that young lady in her pink satin pyjamas. These are real people. They're either campaigning because they're terminally ill themselves, or they're campaigning for family members, and apparently many of them have had to be supported because there's been such an outcry about this, including the Samaritans. And here in the Mail, you'll see that the Samaritans have been very busy slapping helpline posters all over these adverts, telling people where to go should they need help. And I'm hearing from both people that are pro-assisted dying and anti-assisted dying that they are utterly shocked. So let's go back to a dignity in dying again, and let's look at them, because they campaign for choice, access, and control. And they also say, they claim that 84% of the public support this choice for assisted dying. Well, please stay with us again for extra, because I do believe that this is false information and false communication, and we'll look at it more in extra, but stay tuned. So compassion in dying, this is dignity in dying's sister. and they are ready to give you every single bit of help. If you want any help making a decision, you've got it. And here you can see them saying that we want you to be in control at your end of life decisions. But what do they actually offer? What do they tell you to do? Well, a living will, of course. And we've spoken about living wills before, probably for different reasons, because people are scared of going to the NHS. But living wills, it doesn't stop there. They say that you can get help if your relatives' wishes are not being respected even. And actually, a specialist nurse is going to come and help your loved ones. They're going to be heard, unlike the vaccine injured. But that's not all they'll do to help you decide to die. They'll draft letters for you. They'll prepare meetings in advance with doctors. They'll help you ask the right questions. They'll even arrange a nurse to speak with you. Easy peasy. I bet you wish you could get a GP's appointment that quickly. And I bet the vaccine injured wish they could get help and they could get someone to listen to them that quickly. But it doesn't stop there. They can make it. They're saying that you can make a decision for someone else in case you're not able to yourself. But what does the law say? So you go on to see what they say about the loss of mental capacity. Unless that person has made a living will or lasting power of attorney for health and welfare, the decision-making power and responsible falls to professionals, not to family members. So best interests, what does that actually really mean? Well, it actually says here that relatives are pretty shocked because they feel completely unprepared and surprised that professionals are suddenly making decisions on behalf of someone else, especially someone that has been in their family and that they've known and loved for forever. So who is the decision maker? That's what we have to look at. And if apparently, according to Compassion and Dignity in Dying, if there's no lasting power of attorney of health and welfare, the professional in charge of your care will make that decision. Really? Who is that person and what grade is that person? So I consulted Dr. Robert Everett, as I usually do, our wonderful retired GP, a member, and we've done interviews with Robert before. And I asked him and I said, this is a very concerning thing because if you have loss of capacity and professionals are going to take decisions for you. And he directed me to the Office of Public Guardian, Making Decisions, Independent Mental Capacity Advocate Service, who say slightly different. They go on to say, determining a person's best interests. If a person is felt to lack capacity and there's no one suitable to help make decisions about medical treatment, such as family or friends, an independent mental capacity advocate must be consulted. Well, that's very different from what we've just heard, where relatives don't get a say. So the water is slightly muddied there. But also let's go on to the Court of Protection, because Dr. Everett referred me to the Court of Protection, where it says in situations where there is serious doubt or dispute about what is in an incapacitated person's best interests, then healthcare professionals doesn't say they do, can refer the case to the Court of Protection for a ruling. So I'm seeing that there is a lot of debate around this to be had. It's unclear who's saying what and what is going to actually happen in real time. So let's go back to Dignity in Dying and let's look at their patrons, because you might know a few of the names. Sir Patrick Stewart there, Sir Terry Pratchett, and of course Joe Brand. And I went to look at the funding, because where do they get all of this money? It's a big campaign that they're running. And they're not a charity, so they don't actually have to declare what they spend their funds on. And they rely on subscriptions, donations, and wills. And they lobby, they campaign, they work with the media, they brief parliamentarians, and they meet really regularly. But how do they spend their funds? So they spend their funds on awareness and all of these campaigns and advertising. And thanks to Unity Newsnet, because I've been looking at social media intently on how this organisation is funded. And here they're showing Bernard Lewis, who's the founder of River Island. He's donated hundreds of thousands of pounds to both organisations. But you can also see that the Bernard Lewis Family Charity Group have huge Israel connections, and right there on the right hand side you can see all of those connections. The Canary also, I didn't rely just on Unity Newsnet, I went to look at the Canary, and they say too The assisted dying bill is an ableist abomination, not that Kim Leadbeater even realises. And if we go back and look at the Canary in further depth, they talk about this advertising campaign. And just very briefly, in 1 week, 2nd to 8th of November, Dignity in Dying even surpassed the Disasters Emergency Committee in Gaza because of ads. And they'd forked out £30,707 for 134 ads in just 7 days. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. And it goes on, the article, to point out Hannah Sharland from the Canary, who has said basically that this organisation has links with the eugenicist movement, links with Labour government, as we've clearly seen, and that a huge amount of money has been passed into this organisation. There's much more to come on this, much more. But needless to say that heading this organisation is Baroness Meacher, Michael Meacher's wife, and there's much more to be seen because this really is a very dark, slippery slope. More in extra, though.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Debbie, I asked the question, is this a slippery slope? I think we can absolutely say it is. And, I want to absolutely talk in extra about these living wills, because that looks a lot like asset stripping to me, particularly if you're an organisation that is funded through wills. I mean, that well, lots of questions to be asked there. Okay, a little bit of general news here. I'm going to start off with, and thanks to the person who sent this through to me, a job advertisement. Maybe I'll apply for it myself, for a non-executive director at Ofcom to join the advisory committee on disinformation and misinformation. Mark said to me earlier that I was very well qualified for that. I could take that in a number of different ways. We'll talk about that later too. But anyway, I also wanted to remind everybody about the acceptance of cash to be investigated by the Treasury Committee, because the consultation on this ends on Monday at 5 p.m. So just to remind everybody, they are asking a number of questions. For example, what is the current state of and recent trends in the forecast for cash acceptance in the UK? Are there groups in society that disproportionately rely on businesses and public services accepting their cash? And should the government require parts of the economy to always accept cash? I personally think they should, but anyway, that's a question that they're asking, and they're also asking about practical challenges that businesses might face from always having to accept cash, and what would the costs be, and so on, and also how might such a requirement for cash acceptance affect financial services firms? Who cares? Are there any other areas of particular sectors where decline in cash acceptance would cause problems? So, as I say, there is a consultation. The link will be in the show notes under the video on the UK Column website, and everybody has until Monday to make any thoughts known, and you can do that as an individual. So I would just like to encourage everybody to do that. And also just want to let you know that Sucharit Bhakdi, who, of course, a wonderful man and doctor, who is part of the Doctors for COVID Ethics organisation and has spoken out so much over the last number of years on COVID-related issues, is back in court after Christmas on this charge that he has, let's just have a look at what it says. So, having incited hatred against a religious group and attacked the human dignity of others by insulting and maliciously disparaging that religious group while acting in concert in a manner likely to disturb the public peace, and having publicly trivialised an act committed under the rule of National Socialism for the kind described in Section 6(1) of the International Criminal Code in a matter likely to disturb the public peace. And of course, what did he actually do? He criticised Israel's vaccination policy from 2021. And that's all he did. And that is being presented as being somehow anti-Semitic. He was in court and found innocent on this charge several months ago. This is just some footage from outside the court, and you can see the number of police that attended, because they obviously thought that the people that would be there supporting him were going to riot or something. I don't know. But anyway, because apparently there's no double jeopardy in this case, they are going to have another go at trying to get him for this, I believe, in February. So we will keep you posted on it as that develops. Mark, let's come back to you. And you wanted to talk about Donald Trump and the question of tariffs.
Yes, indeed, Mike. And what's interesting is you're seeing things in the media on TV flashing all the time. tariff threat, the threat of tariffs. And I wanted to report this in a way that sort of demythologizes tariffs. But anyway, here's something from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Fort Worth being kind of a twin city of Dallas. Texas economist explains what a Donald Trump tariff plan would mean for the state of Texas in 2025. It really means for the nation, too. And we'll move on from there and briefly explain what this economist is saying. This is from that newspaper. Many Americans are still trying to understand how possible campaign promises made by President-elect Trump following the election could impact them. One of them was to improve the nation's standing in international trade by imposing sweeping tariffs during his second term. However, economists warn that carrying out that pledge might come at a significant cost to American workers. And this is where we hear the same narrative over and over and over again. And it's coming from, in this case, Dennis Jansen, a professor of econ and director of the Private Enterprise Research Center at Texas A&M, which is in College Station, Texas. They call that Bush country, by the way. And he explained to the Star-Telegram his views, the implications of these tariffs, and we'll keep going from there and kind of get through this so I can add a little commentary at the end. How could Trump's tariffs affect Americans is the subhead. Goods imported into the U.S. could be subject to 10 to 20% tariffs in 2025 under Trump. Trump also suggested imposing an additional tariff of at least 60%, that is high, on Chinese goods, and in the event that the border doesn't close, impose a tariff between 25% and 100% on items imported from Mexico. And I'll mention just yesterday, Mike, the new Mexican president, a lady this time, that's a rarity in Mexico, has already tentatively agreed that Mexico will definitely get involved in slowing down or stemming the flow of illegal migrants into the U.S. if they can avoid that tariff. So far, Trump seems to be using the tariff against Mexico more as a bargaining chip, not necessarily a reality, depending on how Mexico cooperates on migration. Anyway, we have a couple quotes with a picture of Mr. Jansen, the Texas A&M econ professor. In these two slides, it gives his view in a summary kind of way. The first one, quote, if we impose a 10% tariff, other countries are going to have a hard time selling stuff to us because the prices are going to be higher and the people in the U.S. are going to buy less. And the other part of his view on this is, quote, so there's a chance we could get into a tariff war. This is the other part of the constant thing that we hear. Prices will go up and there'll be a tariff war. But again, this quote, so there's a chance we could get into a tariff war, which is us raising ours to 10% and they raise theirs to 10%. The government revenue will go up, but I added this emphasis, but international trade will decline. And you see, that's what Trump is really after. He's really after, as far as I can tell, and keep that slide up of that book cover, he's after actually reducing international trade and increasing U.S. self-sufficiency. Maybe not toward autarky, where a nation becomes very significantly self-sufficient. That's a term, autarky, but definitely headed that way. Now, this book cover comes from a late GM executive that I knew personally for a short time, Gus Stelzer. He passed away some years ago. He wrote a book called The Nightmare of Camelot, an expose of the free trade Trojan horse. An excellent book, never got the renown that it should have. And Camelot actually refers, of all times, to the administration of JFK, when Stelzer said that JFK passed a trade law that sort of set in motion the free trade nightmare that we have these days. And I don't know how much JFK was complicit in that. I don't know how much he understood it. I'll talk about some very interesting things regarding JFK's Dallas retirement plan, quote unquote, in extra. But moving on from there, I don't know that we have much more slide-wise. Although this is important as an afterthought. Trump's ambassador to Canada is former Michigan Congressman Pete Hoekstra, who very much shares Trump's tariff and trade philosophy. He's a former Michigan congressman. And the Commerce Department nominee, as this slide also shows, is Howard Lutnick. chairman and CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, a U.S. financial services firm. And it's interesting to note that Cantor Fitzgerald is one of only 24 primary dealers authorized to trade U.S. government securities with the New York Federal Reserve. That's a very exclusive and big deal. But what's interesting about Mr. Lutnick is he spoke at that major recent Trump rally at Madison Square Garden and recalled the strength of the U.S. economy. Way back in 1900, the U.S. economy survived with no income tax whatsoever, but high tariffs. And he therefore supports broad tariffs. Now, I'll just add, Mike, that one of the things that is being completely overlooked in these constant reports, tariffs are going to raise prices, it's going to start a tariff war. This is what we hear over and over again, is, as I indicated here, it begins to put a different source of revenue into the U.S. Treasury, and that's just the beginning. Tariffs are intended, and I'm looking at my notebook where I scribbled some things down. Tariffs are intended in the medium to long term time frame to protect the U.S. industrial base and prevent dumping, like Chinese dumping, from having an adverse effect on the U.S. economy and on the industrial base. And this is important, and to prevent existing U.S. industrial companies from closing their U.S. factories and therefore prevent them from moving out, closing down here, and moving their factories to cheap labor havens such as Mexico and many other places with much cheaper labor than the U.S. And that, to prevent that from happening, that in turn protects the U.S. tax base, the local and county and state tax base in particular. That tax base funds our roads, it funds our bridges, it funds our schools, the 9/11 emergency system, the police at the local, state, and state levels, fire departments, ambulance, public transportation, all of that. The majority of the tax money that supports those things comes from larger firms like nuclear plants, tool and die shops, various factories making various products, automotive parts, for example. As these tariffs go up, these things are protected. Those jobs stay in place. They're typically good paying jobs. And then that tax base is kept intact. So the people that only argue that tariffs will make things cost more, which is true, and talk about tariff wars, they overlook all these other aspects of tariffs, which used to be one of the main federal revenue sources in the country until the income tax came along, resulting in the 16th Amendment in 1913. So there's a whole background, a whole history to tariffs that's being overlooked constantly in the media. But if Trump follows through putting some of these tariffs in place, in the case of Mexico, maybe only using it for a leverage, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. But at least we can start thinking in a more objective and complete sense about what tariffs are and what they do. So I just wanted to not only report on what Trump is doing, but clarify the whole issue of tariffs today, Mike. So back to you.
Thanks, Mark. There's certainly a lot of discussion needed around that whole issue for sure. Okay, Debi, MHRA board meeting.
Yes, I just wanted to update you. I can't go in news, really. We can't go in news. It'd be rude. It'd be rude not to mention the MHRA. So yes, as most people will recall, I went to the MHRA board meeting last week. And if you remember rightly, they said that there was going to be a December board meeting. And I couldn't quite work out what was going on because nothing's been advertised. So thank you, Mike, for advising that I write to the MHRA press office, which I did, asking them about the December board meeting. And it seems that there's going to be a board seminar format. The board meeting is going to be held in a board seminar format in December, which is going to be a kind of like a little Christmas jolly, which we're not invited to. So the public are not invited to view the MHRA board meeting. How transparent is that? Not. And they'll be having their own little jolly, I'm sure, with mince pies and all sorts of tinsel, maybe to welcome the new chair, or maybe say goodbye to Dame June. Who knows? But we won't know because it's all going to be held in private.
Yes, and a final video clip.
Oh, yes. So, what have the Democrats been doing? Drowning their sorrows since the loss of the election? Well, this is what a bunch of people, it's been circulating all over social media. This is what a bunch of people in Michigan have been doing to console themselves. I'm thinking of going down to the beach myself and screaming at Southwest Water. What do you think?
Yes, okay. The weather may not be up to it just at the moment, but okay. Well, I think there's lots to unpack there as well. Well, but we got to leave that for today. So lots to discuss in extra in a couple of minutes' time. If you're a UK column member, please join us for that. Just stick around on the live stream. Otherwise, have a great weekend. We will be back at 1 p.m. as usual on Monday. See you then. Bye-bye.